What is the outcome when the law itself codifies your existence as a criminal act? In the 6th century, during the reign of Emperor Justinian I, celebrated as Justinian the Great, the Byzantine Empire stood at a pivotal crossroads of imperial ambition, religious doctrine, and moral legislation. As the ruler from 527 to 565 CE, Justinian was profoundly committed to restoring Roman glory, systematizing its laws, and imposing Christian principles not just across his domain but into the most intimate spheres of his subjects' lives. Among his most notorious legal decrees was one that targeted men engaged in same-sex relationships, an edict that powerfully blended the authority of the state with the punitive force of religious dogma. The Codex Justinianus, a key component of the monumental Corpus Juris Civilis, stands as one of history's most significant legal compilations. It explicitly stated that men who are ashamed to be men and were involved in intimate acts with other males were to be put to death. There is no room for interpretation in this declaration. The language is brutally clear, the verdict absolute. Justinian's legal agenda did not emerge from a vacuum. It was a reflection of the moral apprehension that characterized the Byzantine court and the wider Christian hierarchy. Beginning in the late 4th century, emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire had increasingly harmonized their laws with the moral stances of the Church, a trend that gained momentum after the Council of Nicaea and the growing sway of influential bishops like John Chrysostom and Ambrose of Milan. These religious leaders saw same-gender intimacy not merely as a personal sin but as a manifestation of spiritual decay, believing it could invite divine retribution upon the entire empire. It was within this ideological framework that Justinian took these measures to a new extreme. In the year 559 CE, he promulgated a new edict that directly linked non-heteronormative conduct to natural calamities. He proclaimed that cities that harbored such sins would suffer from earthquakes, plagues, and famines, a form of collective punishment for the actions of individuals. This decree was not simply a statement of values. It became an active instrument of oppression, and public executions were carried out in its name. The emperor's motivations, however, were not driven solely by piety. Justinian skillfully used moral legislation as a tool for consolidating his power. By outlawing what were deemed unnatural relations between men, he simultaneously placated the powerful church establishment while showcasing the far-reaching influence of imperial law into the most private facets of human existence. In this manner, the decree served the dual function of enforcing religious conformity and projecting the unassailable power of the emperor. The impact of this law extended beyond execution. Its true effect was one of erasure. It stifled identities, wiped out the memory of relationships, and effectively wrote entire communities out of the historical narrative. No individual names were documented for future generations. No personal stories were allowed to survive. All that remains is the emperor's decree and the lethal silence that followed. Thus, with a single legal phrase etched into the imperial code, the state was refashioned into an executioner, the church into a judge, and love itself into a transgression punishable by death. This verdict was not confined to legal texts. It manifested with brutal reality on city streets, in public squares, and before the gaze of horrified crowds. Once Emperor Justinian's law criminalizing unnatural relations was put into practice, it initiated a dark era of public performance. Execution was transformed into more than a punishment. It became a ceremonial shaming, a staged act intended to instill fear, impose conformity, and obliterate. Accounts from the period are few and cautious, yet within this historical quiet, the reverberations of dread persist. Procopius of Caesarea, the court historian who documented Justinian's era, conspicuously avoided mentioning these laws in his official histories. However, in his secret history, he alluded to the regime's pervasive cruelty, portraying a time where bodies perished, but spirits were crushed beyond recognition. While Procopius did not explicitly link this to same-sex relationships, His accounts of executions for moral deviance align with the vicious enforcement of Justinian's decrees. The executions were intentionally public. Men accused under the anti-sodomy statutes were forcibly removed from their residences or captured in military sweeps. They were disrobed, marched through public thoroughfares, and branded with signs detailing their supposed crimes. Some were burned at the stake, a penalty reserved for acts the state deemed spiritually polluting. In earlier times, others were decapitated or fed to wild animals, a practice that recalled Roman precedents for handling unnatural crimes. In Constantinople, the empire's glittering capital, these spectacles were not hidden away. Crowds were actively gathered. The condemned were led to execution sites under the gaze of massive icons and Christian emblems. The use of fire, in particular, was heavy with symbolism. It was understood as an agent of purification. The blaze was thought to purge the transgression while it destroyed the flesh. This was not merely an execution. It was an act of annihilation sanctioned by religious belief. The intended message was unmistakable. The law did not just penalize. It was meant to purge the state of a moral contagion. Yet these public killings served a secondary function. They solidified the emperor's authority through the use of terror. In a culture that viewed the emperor as God's representative on earth, the law was imbued with divine authority. Defying Justinian's edict was therefore not merely a legal offense. It was an act of religious rebellion. Execution was not only legally sanctioned, it was sanctified. The sword and the flame were elevated to emblems of righteousness. But they also pointed to a more profound truth. When a state makes an identity illegal, brutality is redefined as justice, and imposed silence passes for order. Banishment and public shaming were not lenient alternatives. They were purposeful instruments of destruction, meticulously designed to ruin the reputation, strip the dignity, and foreclose the future of anyone accused under Justinian's laws. When the death penalty was not carried out, the substitute was a gradual dissolution of self. Men found guilty of non-heteronormative acts could be sentenced to a lifetime of exile, have their property confiscated, and be subjected to public humiliation before being cast out. This was more than simple relocation. It was a form of civic death. Once exiled, a man effectively vanished from the consciousness of Byzantine society. His name, his rights as a citizen, and his standing within the Christian faith were systematically erased. The ritual of public penance was just as ruinous. In church courtyards and town squares, the accused could be forced to proclaim their alleged sins before gathered onlookers, frequently clothed in rough penitential attire, sometimes in chains, and encircled by clergy who recited prayers condemning their conduct. This performance was engineered to dismantle a person's sense of self. By making the accused a public spectacle of shame, the state and church drove home the message that these individuals were no longer considered part of the empire's moral fabric. Such penalties were rooted in long-standing Roman and Christian legal traditions. Roman emperors had often employed banishment to suppress political and moral nonconformists. However, in the 6th century Byzantine world, exile became intertwined with Christian concepts of atonement. Justinian's decrees cemented this union. In his novels, New Laws that added to the Codex, the emperor instructed bishops and state officials to denounce and expel men convicted of non-heteronormative acts, stating their offenses called down divine wrath upon the cities. Those who were not executed were to face public disgrace and removal, an earthly penalty to correspond with their spiritual one. In reality, this meant the condemned were stripped of all they had. Their assets were seized, their families were disgraced, and their residences could be claimed by the state. Even after being exiled, they remained under surveillance and faced restrictions. Imperial archives document instances of exiles being dispatched to remote provinces, monasteries, or penal colonies, where they endured severe hardship. Very few ever came back. In this way, the Byzantine state and church wove together execution, banishment, and public humiliation into a single system of oppression. Physical death was not always the goal. Social and historical oblivion often sufficed. In the Byzantine Empire, one's standing was not privately ruined. It was publicly disassembled. These punishments reveal a terrifying reality. When law is fueled by fear, identity itself can be criminalized, and the state gains the power to reshape the very soul of its subjects. How did Justinian's laws reflect the fusion of state control and religious doctrine in the Byzantine Empire? Comment below. As Procopius wrote in Secret History, he was never inclined to show mercy, only to destroy.